I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Well, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. On Searching for Heroes, I often speak with people about the most difficult things that they've been through in life. And with that, I'm always curious to hear what or who they believe is to thank for helping them keep going and to stay resilient, even on their darkest days. For many people, that answer involves their family, community, and oftentimes their faith. I think it is really important that we all find time to reflect on what we believe in. And also, I think how our beliefs play such a critical role in providing us with peace and getting us through the things that may at first seem impossible. With that in mind, I decided to revisit my conversation with disaster ministry expert Dr. Jamie Aten. We spoke right ahead of Ash Wednesday, which marks the start of the Lenten season, a 40-day period that concludes right ahead of Easter Sunday. It represents a season of reflection, sacrifice, faith, and resilience, which beautifully encapsulates our conversation. Jamie's research is an incredible analysis of how immense of a role faith and spiritual support can play in fostering resilience and helping people make sense of suffering. Here's our conversation.
I never thought I would spend my career helping others through trauma. That wasn't part of my plan. But right after I finished up my graduate school training and moved to South Mississippi to take my first teaching job, Hurricane Katrina struck just 6 days later. So that's how I first got involved, and within a few weeks started doing research and training and doing mobilizing teams. And so that's how I first got into this work. But at the same time, I do sometimes joke that being from Illinois and being a lifelong Cubs fan, that could be maybe the underlying source of why I'm really into trauma.
And you probably need a lot of treatment there.
Absolutely.
I suppose there are two things I want to look at. First of all is, talk to me a little bit about what the effect trauma has on somebody who is going through it, the impact it has on it. And then afterwards we'll talk about, what you can do for someone who has gone through a traumatic event. But let's start with someone who has just experienced something which perhaps they were not expecting, something dramatic. What does that do to a person? How does it change them? What do they have to encounter?
When a person goes through trauma, it can really shake their entire world, that it can turn things upside down. And the way that we thought we understood our life can start to be interrupted. And so oftentimes what will happen is that it really impacts all of who we are, our emotions, our feelings, our thought processes, even our physical selves. And we've been able to see through some of our research, even a person's spirituality.
And I suppose there are two ways of encountering trauma. One is to say, my life has changed forever. I'll never get back to where I was. I've lost my identity. And is the alternative is to say, I've been knocked down. Let's find a way through. And it does feel as if, people go through trauma in two very different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. We do tend to see people take two different kind of courses when they go through a major traumatic event. That for some people, what happens is that it really splits life into the before the trauma and after the trauma. But the goal is for us to start to work of how do we integrate that trauma into the way we understand and see the world. The more we can start to integrate that into our own experiences, the more healthy we'll be in the long term. And so part of that means trying to make meaning out of it. But it's okay if you don't fully make meaning. We're going to have those why questions, because we did some research where we found that asking those why questions, even if you don't arrive to meaning at the end of it, still has a positive impact on a person's experience. So I guess the kind of takeaway is to keep grappling with it.
Bringing trauma into how you see the world, as you say there, would that just then be acknowledgement that someone has gone through something traumatic, and is that an acceptance that, trauma happens to, 70% of people? So it's about understanding that. It's about realizing that that many people share that.
Yeah, I think there's something really powerful to recognize that you're not alone. Just like what you were talking about, that statistic of about 70% of people will experience a major traumatic event at some point in their life. That this isn't something that just one person goes through, but it's really a universal experience. And when I say about trying to accept it and integrate it into our life, it's trying to find ways to come to terms of how to keep living despite trauma. Oftentimes when we talk about resilience, we think about it as trying to bounce back, which is something we should try to do. But a lot of people who've gone through a trauma, oftentimes we think of it, how we often cope. Some people describe resilience as kind of like taking a beach ball and putting it underwater, and that our goal is to bounce back the same way you would see a beach ball emerge from the water after being put down under the pressure. But oftentimes what happens in reality is that there's not always a bouncing back, or at least not as quickly as what we would hope. And that can sometimes become discouraging. But if we can start to accept the fact that we've been through something hard, it's going to take time, and life may or may not go back to exactly how it was, that when we can start focusing not just on getting back to how life was, but focusing more on how to continue to live even amidst the hardship, the more healthy we'll be in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about adapting rather than just trying to go back to where you were. I couldn't agree with you more. Do you also think that people can become stronger after they've gone through trauma? You've gone through something terrible, but when you come out the other side and you've gone through it, does that make you sort of a wiser, stronger person?
It can. In fact, we've actually done some studies on this where there's a concept called post-traumatic growth that really speaks to exactly what you're talking about, of that idea that sometimes we can actually grow out of these hardships to become stronger, to maybe become more insightful or strengthen our relationships with others. But one of the things that we found, for instance, we did a study where we actually were surveying about 1,500 people right before a major hurricane hit. And then we surveyed them right after it hit, and then tracked them for a long period of time. And what we found is that post-traumatic growth absolutely is real, that it can occur, but it doesn't always look exactly the way we think it does. By that, I mean that sometimes we think that that growth is all that's there. But in fact, a lot of people go through trauma, will have growth, but still have some hardship. But just because you have hardship doesn't mean you haven't grown immensely.
That's interesting. How about yourself on a personal level? Because, I know that you are a cancer survivor. You mentioned earlier that you were, in the middle of Hurricane Katrina. What were your own experiences with trauma like, and how did you get through them?
And my own experience of trauma really changed a lot of the ways that I have come to understand trauma as well as resilience. I gave that example of the beach ball kind of metaphor. That's how I would have viewed resilience prior to my own cancer experience. And for me, when I was diagnosed, it really felt like my own personal disaster. I had spent at that point 8 years studying disasters all around the globe. And at this point, it was as though it was unfolding inside of me. And what I realized is that a lot of resilience and our strength doesn't just come from us, but it comes from our family, from our friends, from those that are around us. And then for me too, personally, my faith also played a major role in that process.
Yeah, and I was going to come to faith as well, because you've talked a lot about the scientific findings you've done, but I know you write also about how the scientific findings, you transform those into sort of spiritual care. And can you tell us a little bit about that, how you take scientific studies, but then you use those to help people with their spirituality?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's so funny. Whenever we do our workshop we created an intervention and an organization called Spiritual First Aid that we do this through. And whenever we're giving our workshops, I often start to get really excited whenever it comes up on research. And what I've come to realize is I'm typically the only person in the room excited about the research. and so I recognize that. But for us, the reason why everything we do starts with research is that we want to make sure that what we're sharing and telling others is actually effective, that it's not just something that we've made up, but it's actually been tested, and that we've studied it in great detail. But then what we do from there is to take that research and to blend it with faith, as well as to blend it with trauma-informed best practices, to be able to create courses and resources that help others, especially everyday helpers, churches, and organizations, to be able to turn their compassion for unmet mental health needs into effective care.
It's an age-old question, but how do you explain the spiritual side to, say, a natural disaster? Many people say, how could God have allowed this earthquake or this hurricane to happen when the people caught up in it weren't sinners or hadn't done anything wrong? How do you explain that?
That's a great question that you're asking. And in fact, we had a large research grant a few years ago where we were studying exactly that question. And what we found was that oftentimes the way people viewed God and understood God prior to a disaster would largely impact, as you might expect, how they would tend to view God in the aftermath. So if people tended to view God as a more loving God prior to the disaster, then they were more likely, even if they lost everything, to say that, God still loves me and cares for me. But now at the same time, the thing that we found, though, that was one of the biggest predictors was the amount of social support that they received, specifically spiritual support. So if they had others come around them during that tragedy, maybe they helped rebuild their home. Maybe people came and helped bring clothes to them. Maybe they prayed for them. That when they experienced that positive spiritual support from others, they were much more likely to view God as more loving and as more caring.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear. Do you think then perhaps there is I think there's a question that you've written about, that there might be a spiritual meaning to our suffering, to traumatic events?
One of the things that we've been able to see, and something that I know that I've experienced in my own life, is that when we are able to incorporate our faith into how we understand what we're going through, that it does help foster resilience. One way to think about that is that, our faith and spirituality can help us to give us kind of a roadmap for how to think about suffering. Most traditions have a lot of depth and ways of practicing and ways of coping with tragedy and providing explanations for some of these things. And that spiritual meaning making can also help buffer from things like post-traumatic stress disorder. So we've done a number of studies where we've seen the more people are able to engage their faith in that meaning making process, that you start to see the PTSD symptoms go down drastically. And also we've replicated something similar in looking at anxiety and even depression.
What about the difference then between, say, children and adults, and how children can get through trauma as opposed to someone who's older?
It's really important that especially if we're thinking about this from how do we help somebody through a trauma, recognize that kids go through and experience it much more differently than we as adults do. We were just talking about meaning making. Well, one of the ways that we often make meaning is by talking to others and through the words that we choose. That helps us make sense of what we're going through. So then if you think about it developmentally with children, they tend to lack the life experience, they lack the words even, and they lack the examples or templates for how do we make meaning. And so it can be very challenging, but one of the best things that we can do for children is just to really care for them, to be there for them, to recognize that when they go through a trauma, it's not uncommon to see them start to kind of regress in their behavior. That could be being a little bit more clingy. Maybe they are afraid to sleep by themselves at night. So the best thing that we can do as parents or as caregivers or friends is to really just be there with them. And then to also try to explain what's going through in developmentally appropriate terms or language, so nothing super complex, and stay away from cliches. Like if somebody maybe died in their life, don't say that person's sleeping. I know that that's a lot easier to say, but that child may actually think that if I fall asleep, is this going to happen to me? So we want to really make sure that we're meeting them with where they're at. And a good way to do that is just to start by asking them of what do you think happened, or how do you understand what has occurred? Because that allows us to meet them where they're at.
Yeah. Do you think that everybody, adults as well, should sort of at some point try and prepare themselves for something traumatic? They should be in a position and have thought about it and be ready, because maybe the hardest part of going through something traumatic is not being ready or have thought about how you would react. So should everyone go through the sort of some kind of training? Should everyone be ready to hopefully they'll tap into something they've thought about?
I absolutely think it's better to be prepared and be on the safe side with whatever we can. And so, especially when we think about our own traumas, I have a colleague of mine who told me that so he's a college professor, and that he used to always give an essay assignment at the beginning of college every year to his students, and would ask them to write about what their life would be like. And everybody always wrote, I see myself getting into a relationship. I see myself in this sort of career. And he's like, not once, Jamie, not once did I ever have a student write, I think I might have an illness, or what happens if I lose my dream job at some point, or what if I never get my dream job? And so we do know, again, from our research, that the more we can kind of prepare for that, even mentally, the more likely we're going to be able to integrate that into our life experience. So let me say that differently. I mentioned to you earlier that I'm a diehard Cubs fan. So as a Cubs fan, I could come into this next season and think the Cubs are absolutely going to win. Nothing's going to go wrong. We're going to win the World Series. No problems along the way. If I really believe that that's what the season's going to look like, I'm going to be really disappointed and disenchanted once the season gets going. But if I can have a reality to know that, okay, we're going to win some games, we're also going to lose some games. Maybe I'm hopeful for these things, but at the same time, this year may not quite turn out how I'm hoping. That's okay. That the more reality-based that we can be with this, the better that we'll be going forward. But not to lose hope. That's the other thing I've taken away from being a Cubs fan.
Yeah, and hope is actually a really interesting one as well, because, should people sort of, when tragedy befalls us, is hope realistic? Is, even if things are terrible, how do you hold on to that piece of hope? Say you're in the middle of a hurricane, you're looking around you and things just seem worse than they've ever seen before. I suppose it's trying to find that hope, even if it might not be right in front of you.
Absolutely. Hope is so essential. And when we're facing something that feels overwhelmed, when we lose hope, it is hard to move forward. And in situations like you're talking about, when we've lost everything around us, it can be really hard to find hope. And so it's looking for those bright spots. When I think about disasters, I often think about a quote from Fred Rogers, from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, that he would often say that, he talked about how his mother had mentioned when things are bad to look for the helpers. And I think there's some real strong truth into that simple lesson. I know I get asked all the time about how do I have hope when I'm working in disaster zones all over the world in some of these worst case scenarios. And for me, it's by the people, finding hope in the relationships or the helpers that are coming in. For me, again, another place is having my own faith and how central that is to finding hope. And then just looking for hope in the small things, realizing that, okay, today I'm not going to be able to rebuild my entire home, but can I maybe search and find one article that was, maybe it's a picture or something that I can salvage that I can take with me, even though I've lost almost everything, and to look for those tiny moments of hope.
We'll be back in a moment with Searching for Heroes. You talk about, having traveled the world and you've seen disasters, on all corners. Have you noticed anything different? Like, do you think that is the culture in America or the community in America different to the resilience of the community as opposed to, somewhere in Africa? Or is resilience the same no matter where you are, or even no matter what religion you follow?
There definitely are some differences across cultures and even different faiths. And so, like, in terms of cultures, for example, you will see a lot of similarity, but oftentimes it's understanding resilience within the context. So I'll actually give an example first here in the U.S. So I ended up responding to Hurricane Harvey and took a team there. And we were there on the ground to do a spiritual first aid training. But when I first got in, one of the things I wanted to do was spend a couple of days going door to door to check in on communities and to hear stories and to understand what people were going through, as well as to offer support and care. And I remember going through this one neighborhood where you just saw everybody's belongings brought out to the edges of the street. They had just lost everything in their homes. And then I turned the corner and suddenly there's this area that's up higher on land. And now you've got all these really large homes with really expensive cars parked out, and you don't hardly see any damage. And I bring this up as an example that those who have fewer resources tend to suffer more and longer. So yes, everybody went through, both of those neighborhoods went through Hurricane Harvey, but because of the types of resources those two communities had or didn't have, it drastically impacted the way their recovery was going to look. So that kind of internal part of what we bring to the experience, that kind of self-resilience is going to look very similar even across cultures. But oftentimes it's that greater context that's going to start to have a longer term impact on how people are going to recover, or at least how hard their journeys are going to be.
Now, in that case, did you see enough support from, say, the richer community to the other community? Did you see people coming out and helping? Or do you think, I would sometimes say that we don't see people helping each other enough, going out and helping their communities enough, just small things day to day. But did you see that happening then, or were you a little bit disappointed with how much support was being given?
In the particular example that I gave of those two neighborhoods after Harvey, there was a disconnect that
Mm.
the people who were living kind of in the lower income area versus those living in the higher income area, they did not know each other. But at the same time, I have seen, for example, in other disasters, when I think about Hurricane Katrina, for example, I did see where people were helping regardless of the economic status. So a lot of it has to do kind of with what the relationship was like before the disasters. I had somebody once ask me, like, what's the best thing you can do to prepare for a disaster? My response wasn't a plan, it wasn't even supplies, it was get to know your neighbor.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, if we don't know our neighbors in the day to day things of life, it's going to be even harder to know them in the midst of a tragedy.
Do you think that that has broken down to a certain degree, that our society is lacking that? I mean, that's certainly, spiritually, there seem to be divides amongst communities. And I wonder why that has happened, do you think? And how can that be fixed?
We definitely have seen over the last decade or so those divides getting more impactful and having more negative consequences.
Just in the last decade, you would say, rather than going back, 100 years.
Oh, even, I mean, you can go all the way back to 100 years and you would see a gradual decline over time.
Hmm.
And I was trying to not go into my professor response there and keep it as short as I could. But if we tracked it back, like you can go all the way back to kind of our agricultural society. So I grew up on a farm and I'm the first member of my family not to go on into farming. But I share that because of the agricultural kind of roots that our country had, you relied on one another.
Yeah.
That your family didn't necessarily move off to another town, that you had to help take over the farm and pitch in even as a kid. So there was a much stronger kind of social bond there. And then as we start to go more into even like the last decade, as we see people coming, more transient, we see more people finding their friendships just through online activities, that despite the fact that we can be more connected than ever, we're actually more lonely than we've ever been.
Hmm.
And then we start to get into these kind of echo chambers where what social psychologists refer to as kind of like in-group, out-group differences, where we start to just gravitate to people who look and act and maybe believe just like us. And then we start to view other people with greater distrust. And especially when you put that in a trauma situation, that heightens those perceptions of differences of otherness and tends to drive the divide even further.
So, what do we do? How do we stop this division? I mean, practically, how can we change it? Is it education? Is it the role of parents to teach their kids at a young age that that's what we've got to do?
I think all of those things that you just mentioned are things that we need to do. But one of the things that we really have focused on as we think about kind of some of the divides that we see, because we're often working in really tense situations, we're also oftentimes working with groups coming from a lot of different backgrounds and are oftentimes kind of in the middle trying to help bring people together to respond. And one of the things that we've found to be really helpful is practicing humility. And so
Mm.
we've done some studies on this as well. One study, for example, was where we got people together in a lab and we brought people in where we had already surveyed them to know what they believed on, all of those topics they say don't talk about at Thanksgiving over the meal. Well, those were the topics that we brought them in to talk about. And so it'd be hot topic political issues, moral issues. And we found people that believed exactly opposite and strongly on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And then we more or less got them together and said, okay, here's a list of topics, discuss amongst yourself. And I stepped out of the room and then turned the heat up to raise the aggression level just a little bit in that room. And what we found was that when somebody perceived the other person as being more humble, even if they completely disagreed with that person, going into the conversation, they were actually much more likely to listen to that person, respect them, and consider what was being said. So when we can try to recognize that we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, but we can also all learn from the other people, that's going to go a long way in helping to kind of smooth some of those divisions that we see.
I suppose having humility, is that because they don't appear as a threat to the other person? Is that basic animal instinct that if they aren't a threat, then you are more likely to get on with them?
Yeah, and it reduces that kind of sense of, it kind of disarms us to some extent in a good way. That, if you go into an argument with somebody right away and you're angry, raising your voice or even just looking upset, you've already kind of set a tone for that conversation, so that other person's defenses are going to jump as well. And so that humility helps us to, come into these conversations more relaxed, more calm. But also, if we're really helping and listening to others with humility, it means that we're actually listening, right? That we're giving the other person a chance too to share their perspective, that we're trying to see things from the other person's perspective. And we feel that as people, and it's something that we don't experience a lot.
What has surprised you most? Is there one thing that has really surprised you about resilience or about trauma, I suppose, that you weren't expecting to see?
I think the biggest surprise for me is the importance of shifting from just thinking about overcoming to learning to endure, and that there's meaning to be found in enduring hardship. So I had mentioned to you about looking at how my perspective of resilience has changed over time. And some of that comes from my own experience, that after going through multiple surgeries, a year-long treatments for my cancer, and then finding out at the end, finally, that I had no longer had stage 4 cancer, that I was actually had no evidence of disease a year after all these treatments and surgeries, I expected I would start to bounce back. And then about 3 months went by, and I remember texting some colleagues of like, hey, I think I'm finally back. I feel like myself again. And then all of a sudden, 6 months later, I would have this kind of new burst of growth, and realizing just how downtrodden I had been, that I had still been going back to that beach ball example, largely inflated. And it took me well over a year to get back to myself in terms of kind of cognitive abilities, my emotional responses, even my ability to think clearly. So there wasn't that beach ball effect. And so that led me to start wondering, well, what was that? And then I looked at other cancer survivors, and I started thinking about other disaster survivors I worked with. And then I thought about the groups that we worked with after wars, where people did not make it through the conflicts, but yet we would still call them resilient, but they never had a chance to bounce back, or maybe their bouncing back was slower. And so started looking into what that could be. And that's when I stumbled onto this concept of spiritual fortitude. And we see that in many faith traditions, especially in the Christian tradition. And we were able to come up with a scale to study that. And what we found is that that kind of idea that I mentioned to you, how important it is to learn how to live in the adversity, not just after it, that comes from that idea of fortitude, that it helps us to metabolize our suffering.
Amazing. Yeah, you sort of answered what was going to be my last question, to be honest, which was if somebody was listening who was going through something traumatic, and not even necessarily traumatic, because I suppose you have the real major trauma, like, surgery and, cancer on one end, for example. But then you've also got day-to-day things, anxiety, financial issues, mental health problems. But first of all, is resilience the same for both, even if it's a big scale traumatic event, or even if it's a smaller daily traumatic event?
I think you could kind of think of resilience as, in some ways, as almost like our reserves, right? That we all have so much energy in a given day. We all have certain strengths, and that those sort of things are what make us resilient, but we all have limits to it. So it's a lot easier to bounce back when things are smaller, because it's not necessarily drained all of our reserves, so to speak. Whereas those bigger issues tend to have a bigger impact on us, and will take more kind of resources, so to speak, to overcome and sustain over time.
So perhaps understand people should also maybe not seek a quick fix in one sense, I suppose, when they have to maybe spread out their resilience in one sense.
Exactly. And again, I think, some of the best advice I think I could give would be just not to go through whether it's a small stressor or a big stressor alone. The more that you can get connected with others, the more that that's going to have a profound impact on your ability to weather these events, whether small or large.
Well, and that's how I was going to finish, was your advice. So that is it. It is look to others, come together, and perhaps that just seems to be just the most incredible solution to almost anything traumatic. Jamie, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed speaking to Jamie. And in fact, so many of the things that he said today really were exactly how I have felt since, I was injured in Ukraine. The journey after something traumatic. But mostly, I think it was how you learn to endure, how you never want to go back and be the same person. You have to learn to adapt. The holding the ball under the water, as he described it. And I'm just so grateful that he was on today. And like we have said, and so many guests have said as well, it's community. You know, if you really want to find what's going to help you, it's surrounding yourself with people who will. And of course, then in turn, there's making sure you do that to others as well. But really fascinating also to hear how he took scientific findings, but then brought them into spiritual care. And I think that many of the people that I've spoken to who have gone through things traumatic at some point question God. They wonder why God allowed that to happen to them. But he was there saying that even though the event itself may appear that God has turned his back on you, when you see the response from countless people, that reminds you that God is there helping you. And that's something I felt personally as well. So I think perhaps it's almost time to do an episode on faith. So maybe I'll do that in the next few weeks as well. But thank you for listening today, everyone. And I'm looking forward to next week as well. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts. And Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.